Hello and welcome to Section 6 of the NIH Precision Nutrition Workshop. I'm here to announce the Early Stage Investigator and Trainee Poster Awards. I'd like to thank all the scientists who submitted posters for this meeting, and those will be available on the website after the meeting closes. We scored the posters for the following attributes: the purpose or clarity stated on the poster, data presented, statistics, how the data were interpreted, and then the relationship, innovation in relationship to precision in nutrition. We gave out 20 poster awards, and I'm going to let this slide sit a minute so you can read the names of the first group and their topic areas from all over the United States. This is the second group that belongs to the 20 poster awardees. This information will be available as a link on the poster part of the website. And then lastly are the final group. The Scientific Consulting Group at the NIH will contact awardees to coordinate these awards. The contact name here is Mark Dennis, and there's his email. If you have not received information regarding your award within 2 weeks, please contact him. Thank you. And now I'm going to bring in the other co-organizers of the meeting, and we will wrap up the discussions from the past days.
Here we are.
Here we are. So please, let's begin.
Yeah, so we just wrapped up our second day, where we basically went through system science, data analytics, and different types of computational analytics. And the first day really covered a lot of the different biological factors and social factors, environmental factors, all the multi-system factors that may affect nutrition. So one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the questions, that there's some themes that are coming out, and we do have some unanswered questions from our previous sessions today. So maybe we can start with some of those questions because I think they're actually quite relevant for the entire meeting as opposed to just specifically the sections. So one of them was the question about data. You know, how do you get the data? So people are saying, yes, we understand that there are all these complex systems that affect nutrition, and it can feel overwhelming. I think Dr. Mabry mentioned the concept of the quote-unquote mother of all models, you know, like a massive model that includes like everything. Or she also used another term to talk about just basically everyone just coming together in one big mass scrum, like all, you know, different disciplines, and it being a bit of a mess. Because you can't really kind of pick and choose where do you actually start. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, like, so maybe like Jose, you can talk about the factors, the different, you know, cardiovascular, we talk about the different organ systems. And Elizabeth, you brought in a lot of the aspects, the social determinants and all the factors that then mediate. You know, where do we start? Where do we start when it comes to precision nutrition rather than getting a fire hose of information?
Well, that's a really difficult question, especially if we listen to Tim Spector. Remember what he said. Do it yourself, right? If we are talking about precision nutrition, probably it's difficult to rely entirely on the data sets that are out there that were not collected specifically for this reason. So I think this program of nutrition for precision health of NIH is really the way to go in order to do the things precise, right? If we want to continue doing the things that we have always done with certain amount of imprecision to be nice, then obviously there are public data sets, right, that we are familiar with them, and we can go there. But I mean, it's not that those data sets are useless. They have been very informative, but we have to use them for the purpose that they were collected, right? And for precision nutrition, we are talking a totally different game, right? And that's why it's so important that we start collecting the data as is necessary for precision.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that for the past decade or so, there has been a smaller group of people who've been pushing this field and have really opened the door. And the NIH's effort now is to really to get more people to walk through that door, and that's a really great event. I also think sometimes we wait and wait and wait, and we never really get started. And so I'm hoping that this effort will really stimulate activity. And what I kind of learned in the last day is one of the places it needs to stimulate the most activity is in training early career people in the analysis of data and modeling. And we're behind on that, obviously. And I'm hoping that some effort is put forward to training as well as to doing the studies themselves.
Well, not only training, not only training, but also keeping them in the business. Yes. Because once we know what is the problem nowadays. If you train these kind of people, they can go for, I will not say better, but really higher, right? At least a paycheck. So we have to really entice them to continue into the field.
Mm-hmm.
Money matters.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the low-hanging fruit do both of you think, in terms of, like, say someone has a blank slate and they say, okay, I'm interested in tackling precision nutrition, but what are some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of questions, do you think?
The microbiome is really launched, and I think that really starting to understand the molecules that are produced through the microbiome and how they signal the body, that's certainly one of them. And we didn't talk a lot about that the last couple of days because that's a pretty advanced field. I also think this question of nutrition and whether or not it's a food component having an effect, or is the food component causing weight gain or weight loss, and it's the weight loss or weight gain that's having the effect. And so trying to figure out how to separate some of the questions of nutrients versus their effect on body weight regulation.
Jose, any thoughts?
Well, yes, it's true that the microbiome is getting a lot of news, and we saw a couple of examples today, right? Still, I think that metabolomics is going to play a big role, and you mentioned that, right? To understand the molecules. But we have to understand how to use metabolomics correctly, because probably we are overusing or misusing the information that we are collecting now. So yes, very promising, but it has to be geared in the right direction in terms of interpretation.
Our models for metabolomics are good, but the concentration of a metabolite can go up because we're eating more, because we're producing more, or because we're utilizing or oxidizing it less. And that's the part that we really don't know. The models aren't that good at really thinking about flux. For you, Bruce, what do you think low-hanging fruit is in terms of how to start?
Well, I was struck by Dr. De La Haye's and Dr. Horn's presentation about, how we have these social environmental systems that people are locked into. So you can tell an individual, all you want, say, oh, no, you need to do this and that. But he or she is often restricted by his or her environment and his or her situation. So I guess there's a difference between, individual nutrition from a precision standpoint, but also precision population nutrition, where you're trying to change things in a quote unquote precise way that will then allow individuals to reach their potential. The advantage of really looking at some of these larger systems is also you are removing the confinement that some people have. So say someone is in a food desert, you can really say all you want about, here are the list of fruits and vegetables that you need to eat, but if they can't access it, they can't access it. So looking at the economic systems, environmental systems, and social systems, like all the social influences that can really affect nutrition and diet, at least from a policy standpoint, and also from a clinical standpoint too, because I think you have dietitians and physicians, nurse practitioners, what have you. When they give advice in the office, the person goes back into his or her milieu, and many times that's not actually addressed. But again, I'm just adding this, not saying that this is the only low-hanging fruit, because I agree with both of you. But
how, picking up on a comment that you made, my dietitian colleagues, the physicians would say that they've been practicing precision medicine for a very long time. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how that base is going to be expanded and what's going to be added to that to change what they've been doing for years.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, because I think one of the things that we probably want to emphasize with this meeting is that it's not as if precision nutrition is something that we're suddenly discovering. Like we searched around the living room, we picked up the couch, we're like, oh, here's precision nutrition. We haven't even looked at it. I think there's been a fair amount of precision nutrition that's been practiced to date, but I think the difference is in the past, people have had to work with what they had at their hands. So, way back when, very little was known about these mechanisms and these complex systems, and you just didn't have the information and data. And even if you did, it was hard to process all these things. So many times you had different healthcare professionals and dietitians, nutritionists working with experience and working with empirical data, et cetera. And I think they did a great job in terms of, okay, well, you've got the patient in front of you, so we were actually having to adjust based on his or her chronic medical conditions or situation or life stage, et cetera. But I think the difference right now is we're at a real inflection point where, okay, computational power has gone through the roof compared to a few decades ago. So, now I think it was one of the speakers that, Dr. Janexi, that she showed the computer that she was working on before. And now you take that computer and now you can get that, within a device this small, or you may not even need that device. It can be on the cloud and you can access through it with an electronic device. So the computational power has changed significantly. And then we've had a growth in terms of the data analytic methodologies and those different types of approaches. And then on top of that, we are now dealing with a fire hose of data. Now, we have to keep in mind that data is not perfect, and a lot of the data is, the quote-unquote big data is very messy. So we shouldn't only say now we have all the data. But I think we're at an inflection point because we have all these combining so that precision nutrition can really go several different directions. So one is what we really want to happen, which is now we've got all these things and we can really make diet and nutrition decision-making even more precise. Like we can incorporate all those different systems that we mentioned in day one and really solve problems, provide solutions in terms of more tailored diets, et cetera. That will be fantastic. The opposite direction is we go the wrong direction. So we use all this data to come up with the wrong conclusions. And I think Professor Parent mentioned some of the perils of doing that today, where you might come up with significant bias. Like you might come up with these situations where, okay, we're hanging our hat on a factor that isn't really a factor that affects nutrition. It's just a side factor. It's a red herring. But, for instance, we'll say, okay, people of certain demographics should have this diet. To me, that's a little scary because we're in effect stereotyping certain groups of people, and we're just taking the science the wrong direction doing that. And of course, there's all the privacy issues and all those different types of things. So I think this is the time where we really want to chart the course for where this whole field of precision nutrition.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we are seeing or what we are hoping is for a transition in which the precision nutrition that has always been practiced as precision medicine, it was subjective based on the expertise or experience of the physician or the dietitian, right, or the school in which got the training, into something that is more bias-free, that objectivity that will give us the precise data and the precise interpretation. And we were reminded, guys, that we have plenty of questions coming.
Yeah, we'll ask our colleagues to see if they can sort them a little bit for us on topic, I think.
Yeah.
For me, you know, we all know this, that if I'm told my genotype and lifestyle means I should eat broccoli, but I hate broccoli, I'm not going to eat broccoli. So it'll be that, really that rollout and the implementation that's going to be important. Along with precision nutrition, I think of all the mobile apps and how that will assist in healthcare delivery. And so that'll be part of this, not just data collection, but hopefully to go on and improve healthcare delivery.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned genotype, and that's great because most of what we call precision nutrition has been built on genotype, because that's what we have, right? Before the microbiome, it was the genotype. And we hear from Tim Spector how, well, you don't need a genotype, right? No, but it's interesting, talking about the perception of even us as investigators, right? That there was a paper in 1990 from Claude Bouchard in Quebec, in which he was using twins to see what was behind weight gain, right? And the results of that was they were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the conclusion was that weight gain was driven by genetics. The correlation was 0.55. So, yep. I mean, so this group saw the glass half full. For example, in the current studies with twins, the correlation, for example, in the response of glucose is 0.53, as is interpreted as nutrition plays, genetics plays a minor role. So we have to make sure that we have a balanced view, and that this is precision nutrition after all. That's what it's like a clock, right? And you need a series of gears, so they have to come together, and there are different sizes. And what we have been doing very often is just to say, okay, this is the gear that gives us what we want, right? No, this small one, doesn't matter too much, it's a small one. And for the clock to be precise, you need all that combination of gears, meaning you need the microbiome, you need the metabolomics, you need all this technology that we are developing and we are trying to use properly.
Yeah, I think one component of this is the social determinants of health that we heard about yesterday. One question from the audience is, really, are there methods already being used that take into account these factors? And yes, they are, and they were mentioned in a number of the talks, and I know you can find various targets for data collection on the NIH website. And also, for Bruce, tell us about the room for impact of psychological variables, personality traits, and individual variation. And before you start, I think Dr. Dossi yesterday really highlighted the effect of taste and food preference. And that is the one thing that the clinician can know. If they make a recommendation for food intake in a patient, that patient will immediately tell you, I don't like that, or I do like this. And so, you know, it is at that end of implementation that I think that the personal traits are going to have to come in. How do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We can't ignore behavioral and personal traits when it comes to nutrition and ultimately its effects. I think the challenge is we have to understand that they're quite complex themselves. So whatever approach we use, we have to tease out that complexity. So the danger, I think, is if we say, okay, you know, I'm thinking of a worst case scenario where you're just labeling each individual person with a label and say, you know, people who do this should then get this diet, for instance, and that will oversimplify a situation. So it's almost like it's stereotyping, essentially. You know, someone walks in and say, "Oh, you're a person G," and people who have a G characteristics, therefore, you know, here's your packet or here's a list of what you're supposed to eat. I think that would be a danger, encouraging those type of things. But if we do understand that these are modifying factors that then, you know, have a cascading effect. So, for instance, some of your personality traits may be from your environment. So, say you have a very stressful work situation. You're working, 3 different jobs. You just don't have time. Then you might be characterized as anxious or nervous or irritated or something of that sort. Well, that's not necessary because you have that personality trait. It's because your environment. So yes is the short answer. We should incorporate it, but we really should understand how these then affect each other. And I think the advantage of things like modeling and simulation is that you can simulate and get at these different types of mechanisms. You can say, what happens if we take away the work stress? Or what happens if we suddenly give the person 4 or 5 more hours of free time? I mean, it'd be great to have 4 or 5 hours of free time in general, but if you get maybe a half an hour or an hour additional free time each day, what then would allow that person? What would allow that person then be allowed to do? And it's hard to do in a natural setting, but you can simulate that and see what might happen. So complex, but I think it's important.
Yeah. Jose, do you want to address the vulnerable populations comment, or would you like me to?
Let's see. Okay, well, obviously, what we are trying to do here is to provide precision nutritional health for everybody, right? And it could be viewed at this point as something elitist, because only a few will have access to that. And I will say that probably at the beginning that's the case, but that has happened with every development, whether it are electronics or any other things that we use commonly. So what we need to do, obviously, is to make sure that we don't increase that gap that we have now in terms of healthcare, and that this is part of regular prevention, right? In terms of insurance companies and health providers, that they incorporate this as a benefit for the subject, because we know if we are doing this correctly, then it's going to be preventive measure, and it's always much cheaper than the alternative.
Yeah, we can always we must take the recommendations in terms of research, right? The goal of the precision nutrition effort at the NIH is to have a nicely diverse population that goes into the future of studies. And that's diversity by environment, by age, by race, ethnicity, sex, all of that. And to think about urban and rural also. So to me, we need the data to be able to make recommendations for all people. And so really this starts at the recruitment phase for research.
I also think that one of the reasons why we really also need to look at the population level as well is because a lot of people are affected by these systems and become vulnerable because of these broken systems. So for instance, if people are mired in a certain economic level or a certain environment, then that makes them be more vulnerable in many different ways. And so if we just focus on the individual, then the risk is to think everything is attributable to the individual. And then you overlook these kind of larger systems. So if we do it right, I think precision nutrition and all these different types of computational analytics can actually help vulnerable populations and help relieve them in many ways. But again, I think it's in a way you actually do it as opposed to the you have available.
Yeah. One of the topics for this morning, which was really important, was about educating the educators, and this This goes from both the researchers who are collecting the data and all the way to healthcare. Can you talk, Bruce, a little bit about ways that are being explored to increase the number of investigators in this field?
I think one of the keys is we really want to generate a new generation of hybrid investigators, hybrid researchers, and hybrid scientists. One of the approaches that I've seen over the past couple decades is, you bring together multidisciplinary teams, but there's still there can be a lot of spacing between the investigators. And sometimes you bring people together for the purposes of a grant or, maybe like a quick consortium or something of that sort. But we have to remember that because we have these silos, people have different languages, people have different approaches. And also, if we look at, other fields, they've really advanced when you've had these hybrid individuals where they can serve as the glue between people who are steeped in different areas of expertise. So that, you always talk about the people who go real deep in different areas and then the connectors, and people who say, okay, I understand nutrition enough, not from a point where like I've read a single article or I've read a popular article, but I actually have done it for a number of years, and I understand the computational analytics so that I know the details of those. I think it's important because what I've actually seen is on different sides or different groups, certain biases to approaches. Like there can be the bias that when people who are steeped in the methodologies, they may say, oh, well, nutrition's easy. You just, or, eat less sugar. And, of course, I'm simplifying it, but I've seen people who say, okay, it's easy. The complicated part is the analytics and the methodology. And that's not really the case because nutrition is extremely complex, and it's, there's so many subtleties in it that you really have to actually be steeped in it for a long time to really understand. On the flip side, I've seen people in nutrition or other health areas say, okay, well, the analytics is just like a hammer or a nail, and just like, can't you just plug things in and just do it? Just do it. In fact, I remember one time we were building a simulation model, and we were presenting this to some decision makers, and they said, okay, that's good, you're explaining all of it, but can't you just give me a button that I can press? And I press it, like one of those buttons you see in the I think or something of that sort, where you just press it and give me the answer. And we said no, and it's not that simple. So I think some of that divide needs to be resolved by people in the middle. So it's really encouraging these hybrid fields, and I think not just developing the programs, but people also need a career path. They can't finish a program and then go out into the real world, or the quote unquote real world, and find that, okay, well, you are neither here nor there when it comes to different departments, or neither here nor there when it comes to organizational structure, and the incentives aren't there. So I think there also needs to be initiatives to say, we are really going to foster and incentivize development of these transdisciplinary fields. So I think that needs to occur at the same time.
Yeah, and sometimes when you've got a grant that has kind of equal parts two things, you can't find the right institute, you can't find the right reviewers. You have to, right? Because we're really trying to change things, and so anybody who's willing to work across the aisle, that'd be great. That would be great.
Well, Bruce, coming back to your comment, everybody's comment about nutrition being simple or complicated. Well, that's what we have here from the initial introduction by Dr. Rogers. This is complicated, and then we have seen the same thing repeating, right? So something that we have to make sure that is the goal of precision nutrition is precisely to remove that complexity from the end user, which is the people. So by being precise, we don't, then the user will not have to be thinking, okay, so today what is good? Oh, tomorrow, what should I be taking? No? So it's very important that the translation, yes, we will go through all that complexity that we know we have to go through during the research component. But then when that is delivered to the individual, it has to be real simple. So they follow the recommendation without having to be thinking the way that they are thinking now. So I think that's a very important goal that we have at least in the research part, right? That we come out with very simple translations and applications.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often talk about, in the system science world, complex does not mean complicated. And we distinguish between complex and complicated, because complex means that there's a system that involves, all these different components and these pathways, et cetera. But many times what we found in other areas, outside nutrition, that when you develop these computer simulation models that really represent the different mechanisms, the actual solutions many times are not that complicated. They're simple because we see, there's a branch point where that's the critical path. You really want to affect that critical path because then everything cascades from there. And the solution is actually simple, and you can show that in a simple manner. So I think one of the misconceptions when we, pull things together, everyone puts up that foresight model or the map showing how everything's connected, and it looks like spaghetti with a bunch of meatballs thrown in there. That is just to essentially show how complex things are, but it's not supposed to overwhelm everyone, because then what I've seen many times is people say, well, if we're going to intervene when it comes to the obesity epidemic, where do we start? It's just so all over the place. But we've actually found that there are many times situations, push points, where you can actually affect those critical paths, and then that becomes simpler in quotes. So
yeah. I was taught by a modeler, Bob Fair, an excellent scientist, a number of years ago, that basic scientists have models. They just don't think of them that way. And if we would all write down how we think things work, the branch points will be there, the control points will be there. And this is, to me, this is precision nutrition is an effort to streamline that and to make it available to a greater number of people. But it does come to us intrinsically if we can begin to accept it. I'd like to ask about the question, and I raised this yesterday, about whether or not, how do we control? Do we control our nutrition environments that we're trying to do research in, or do we collect a bunch of uncontrolled data and look for trends? And a good number of scientists all want to control everything, and I'm going to give an example of controlling exercise the day before an oral glucose tolerance test, or alcohol intake. We've heard a lot about sleep, really trying to take that into account. And so the question is, do we take it into account or do we control it? And I think, Jose, you mentioned about a biological effect versus a real life situation. Could you speak a little to that?
We discussed about that yesterday, and it's just that one thing is to understand how things are working, which is necessary, right? And that's where the control comes. And the other thing is to really provide the answer to the individual, which is out of control, uncontrolled, right? In environment. Right. So I think you have to play both sides, right? To do it in a very controlled environment in order to understand, and then keep translating that to the real life and see how it's reflected, right? If something then doesn't work, so, well, here we have one more factor, we have something else that we didn't account for, and then it's messing up the result, right? So I think we need both. But the trend has been that, at least for grants, right, you have to control for everything. And I think we have to be a little bit more permissive in terms of that, because the other side of the coin is also obviously very important.
Yeah, or have some real creativity in our study designs. I'm reminded of a paper, and I think it's by Jonathan Purnell, where they fed high carbohydrate diets, and they literally had to overfeed people more food than they wanted. They were low carb, high protein diets, and they kept these people weight stable. They made their measurements, and then they provided that exact same diet, but allowed people to eat as much as they wanted. And of course, when they did that, the weight came down. So they got to see the effect of the biological effects of that low carb at weight stability, and then to see how it really affects real life. This adds to the duration of studies, probably increased variability when you're really looking at a real world setting. And so the costs will go up, the sample sizes need to go up to take this into account. But I'd like to see people really define why it is they're controlling for weight loss or not controlling for weight loss, those other kinds of effects, so that we can start to think about a step toward real world dietary effects.
This is where I think computational analytics and different data analytics can really play a big part, because what I'm hearing is it's important to have both controlled and uncontrolled studies, because both have their advantages and disadvantages. So why choose between one and the other? But instead, what you can do is use different types of data analytic approaches to merge the two, to bring things together. And this also addresses one of the attendees' questions, which is, how do you deal with situations where you have incomplete data, missing data, et cetera? So I give the example of, well, of course, this is a timely example, the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are in exactly that situation, where we have a combination of different types of clinical trials, and then clinical studies, and then case series, and epidemiological data that's messy, and people are trying to bring it all together and trying to quickly make conclusions about the virus and the pandemic. And one of the things that's linking these things are computer models and different types of data analytics. So for instance, you have, maybe a biological study shows, here is the characteristics of the virus. An epidemiological study is showing, okay, these are the people that have been infected, reported cases. Okay, how do we determine the transmission? Well, a model was used to do that. So infectious diseases is one of the areas where some of these analytics took hold earlier, just because of necessity. Because if you want to study an epidemic, you can't sit there and say, okay, I'm going to release this pathogen and see what happens. We would have problems with the IRB doing that. But so you had to develop models to bring everything together. So why not do that with nutrition? Why keep striving for the perfect study, but instead having multiple studies and bring them together?
Yes, yeah. I'd like to read a question or a comment. A challenge is to not wait for perfection before developing precision nutrition. And I think that's why we're here today. How can the field not be overwhelmed by complexity, but rather start with version 1 and then develop pathways for continuous improvement through models, which we heard a lot about today, reiterations and retesting.
Well, I will agree with that, obviously. I mean, if we, after listening to all that and seeing all that we have seen, honestly, one can say how we can put all this together and how we can get to that perfection, right? I think it's impossible. I mean, we have to start somewhere, but we have to start with the right food, I mean, with solid food, and then move from there. So, I mean, yeah, I agree with that comment about having version 1, but operational.
Yeah. And one of the questions has been, and Bruce, you started to talk about this, is why now? Can you talk a little bit about maybe how things have evolved this last decade or 2 decades, that this is important to do now?
Yeah, I think we've really seen we're at an inflection point because we have a situation where the data is really picked up, but it's picked up in a way that's not really organized. So you see, with all these apps, with all these websites, with everything, just a mass amount of data, and people just trying to figure out what to do with the data. So there's so many situations where I have people come up to me and say, "Yeah, I have a bunch of data. Can you tell me what to do with it, or give me some insights?" So it's a hammer looking for a nail. And then you see, I had mentioned previously, the computational power has really ramped up recently. And then you also have a situation where we understand these pathways so much better now than we did several decades ago. And not just the biological pathways, but we also understand the social economic pathways better as well. And so we've seen an explosion in science, but we're at a risky stage too, where we could go the wrong direction and come up with these. And we, today, many of our distinguished speakers talked about the perils in terms of losing privacy and all these different things. And actually, there's a question from one of the attendees that talks about like long-term future precision nutrition. Do you have like tailored diet recommendations that they have to navigate or make choices to implement, or will people be given like pills or shakes that replace food choices? Sort of like the Star Trek situation where you like that's your dinner. I mean that's an interesting question in terms of like how we're progressing. What are your thoughts about that?
We eat for joy.
Yeah,
we don't breathe. Go ahead.
Now that we have been asked that question year after year for the last 30 years, probably. As we evolve with this, we'll be eating pills, of different colors. And well, my impression and also my hope is that will never be the case, right? So obviously,
we must breathe to live. We must breathe to live. We must sleep to live. There is some discussion about whether we actually have to move to live, but we must eat to live. And so it has a very unique position in our physiology, and that joy associated with it will never be removed. And I think in terms of dietary adherence, the most success comes when it's tailored to food preferences and social factors. That's very clear. We have. Go ahead.
That raises another interesting point with precision nutrition. So it's not just looking at cardiovascular outcomes and those things, but also psychological and social outcomes, right? So having a situation and say, hey, what are you doing at 6 p.m.? Do you want to share some blue pills together? It doesn't have the same effect as let's choose what kind of cuisine we're going to eat. So yeah, maybe factoring those things as well, like the psychosocial benefits of food and how it's actually consumed should probably be factored in precision nutrition as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, for example, one of the conclusions of the paper that Tina Spector showed in Nature Medicine that was published in June, that precisely that interaction, right, that includes not only with whom or what, but also when, as it was mentioned also yesterday, is more important than many of the biological measurements that we are pursuing, right, with our omics. So yeah, I mean that has to be part of the equation, obviously.
Here's another question. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just going to mention that many of us who work in the weight loss field are struck by the 1 or 2 patients out of 20 who need a little bit of information and then move forward by themselves. They seem to need much less treatment support. And I think expansion in terms of understanding what's going on in the brain is going to be part of this, needs to be part of this. And I'm struck by one of the factors that we have so little ability to test, and that's hunger. We ask people, hormones predict it, kind of, and portions of the brain might light up. But we have a terrible ability to precisely measure hunger, and that's going to get in the way, I think, in terms of this, until we find better ways to understand what's driving food intake.
There's another question from the attendees, which asks about, the research model itself. Should this be an academic-only model, or what can be gained from forging industry, academic alliances here? What are the risks? We need to make sure that the foundation supports the tower, is the comment. Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
I don't think so. How can academics do this alone? I don't think they can.
No. We are seeing the success of those clear merging of, by clear I mean transparent, merge of the academics and the private sector. And they have a muscle that we don't have. And we should get together in order to move further and faster.
It also seems like, especially Elizabeth, given the things that were discussed during your section, and as well as what was mentioned by Dr. Pronk today, we're dealing with these kind of larger systems with all these different things. So now we're not just talking about, industry when it comes to, AI stuff, or industry when it comes to the food industry, but all these other sectors, like the business sectors, the cultural sectors, et cetera, that then affect all these different things. So it seems like precision nutrition in many ways will expand the relevant players in terms of research. And also, I think Dr. Pronk mentioned, the concept of translation. So if you're already engaging people in many different sectors, then translating the findings will be a lot easier, it seems like.
Yeah, and the ability to have a better data set, right? Because you're collecting outcomes across a broader range of what impacts someone's life. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we have a question here that is specific to the Nutrition for Precision Health program. And obviously the goal is to recruit a very diverse population. And I mean, we all agree that this is absolutely necessary. However, we run into a problem. It's the statistical power, right? Because the moment that you start entering more diversity, you need more people and you need more budget. So how, in this case, artificial intelligence could help to make easier for the interventionists, right, to deal with those problems?
Yeah, it seems like, so AI is this really broad term, which basically just means, and I think Dr. Hammond presented the definition. Essentially, when a computer does something that a task that resembles what a human brain would do, right? Any task. So a simple thing like you could create a program that just flips a coin 50 times. That in essence, in some ways, is AI, because a person could do that, but it's not as useful. So we have to be careful in terms of making sure that not only when we use AI, we have to be clear about what actually is going into it. What's going into the algorithm, what's going into the development of it, so that you don't start baking in biases or start baking in certain things, certain directions, or even stigma into it. So I think at best it can actually help resolve disparities, because it can help identify some of the broken systems that are leading to it. But at its worst, it can worsen disparities. And that's why I really think it's so important to get the right people at the table with the right expertise. So you need people who understand nutrition to see how nutritional disparities could be worsening. You need people who understand the social systems and economic systems to show how those things can be deepened if you have the wrong AI approaches.
Yeah. Is our goal to compare precision nutrition results to the one-size-fits-all way of doing things, which we've been? I do know of one study someone's conducting in which they've got one arm of their study where they're using standard medical care and the other where it's precision. Jose, how do you think about, should those be in the same, or have we already got a lot on our plate?
Well, obviously, we have to demonstrate that all this experimentation and all this knowledge that we are earning, it will result in something that is better than what we have. There has been a few studies, and Food for Me is one example of that, in which it was one-size-fits-all recommendation versus different levels of personalization, going from very simple to genetics, right? And the outcome of that study that was conducted in Europe is that any level of personalization makes people more think better about what they are eating or eating healthier, right? Than just the one-size-fits-all. So from that perspective, I think the question or the answer is relatively obvious, right? But we have to demonstrate that probably a few more times in order to convince those that are proponents of one-size-fits-all that probably we should move to the other side.
Yeah, I have a really hard question, and that is, what is the future of national guidelines by our professional bodies like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Cancer Association, or the dietary guidelines? What do you say? Maybe you don't know the answer to this, but it's certainly been brought up.
I don't think we know the answer to that, obviously. I think the dietary guidelines will be with us for some time in the future, right? But it's up to us to provide the proof of concept that we have to evolve and from national to personal.
Yeah. I think those guidelines can evolve with information from Precision Nutrition. Yeah,
I was on a National Academy's committee that reviewed the process of the dietary guidelines of America and provided recommendations in terms of how that process can be adapted or changed. And again, I want to emphasize that we understood that it's a challenge to do it, and the committees have done a remarkable job in really synthesizing information, coming up with recommendations. But this was more like, okay, how can we adjust it going forward, given that we have evolving data and approaches. So we did recommend, integrating more system science and integrating more of these different types of computational analytics to then come up with recommendations that may be more specific to different groups. And so the way I say it is there's always going to be a need for overall guidelines, just to basically frame the entire population, because we have to take a population level view of these things in addition to the individual level, and look at both at the same time, because a policymaker many times is faced with difficult decisions. He or she can't say, okay, I'm overseeing 10 million people. I'm going to ask each and every person what I should do. You'd probably be ready with an answer in about 5 years. So, so they need to make some general suggestions or recommendations. So there's always going to be some need for overarching guidelines. The question is, how detailed should those guidelines be? Like, how many subsets should there be? And I think there'll probably be a lot more subsets than there have been in the past. But, there's always going to be a need for general guidelines.
Yeah, thank you for those important comments.
So let's see, what else do we have on the attendees' questions that we haven't yet addressed?
Almost addressed all of them. There is this concept of whether this process will intimidate the public. Is it unattainable? And I think we've got enough data now to suggest that this way of seeking knowledge and discovery is really going to be beneficial. And as you said, Jose, it's really how it's presented at the end, and whether we can, the physician use in the end. It's that user end. I think that's we don't know what's going to happen there until we see how the data come. I think over the next 10 years or so.
Well, I remember one of our speakers in the first session identified as a major gap intervention studies, right? RCTs. We already talked about that, right? So we have to keep in mind that the DAJ, the dietary guidelines, it depends on systematic reviews, right? Therefore, we need those RCTs to fit those future dietary guidelines, right? In fact, the recommendation of the current cycle is to include Mendelian randomization in future studies. So you see, we are moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think one other theme that I've heard over the last couple of days is this idea of we test various levels of drugs. We should be testing potentially various levels of food components as well, so that we aren't testing one diet. We might ratchet up vitamin C at various doses. And I think that's one aspect that could be included in a number of studies that would help us understand the dose by person interaction.
Yeah, but that adds a complexity.
Yes.
That is another complexity, which is the fact that in order to do studies, multi-center studies, the diets, the foods in the diets, they have to be very well standardized. We hear yesterday Barabasi talking about the dark matter of food and so on. However, he kind of dismissed a little bit the fact that the same food with the same name, it can have substantial difference in terms of those active compounds. An example, for example, is olive oil, right? I mean, you can put in the intervention studies, okay, so many milliliters of olive oil per day, that's fine, right? But then I think that olive oil has to be the same for everybody, because oleocanthal, that is one of these functional compounds that has been discovered. It depends on which olive oil you are using. It can vary in one order of magnitude. So we have to make sure that we standardize very well the food that goes into those interventions.
Yeah. As you increase one nutrient, for instance, if you have 4 diets that vary in iron content, the increasing iron, for instance, could affect some other nutrient. But I think that the idea of testing one diet for many people is the opposite of what we're talking about today. Yeah.
I think we have just a few minutes left in our hour, and then there's a few outstanding questions. I don't think we can get to all the questions, but maybe we can get to a few of the key ones. I also wanted just to mention a comment. Someone commented that the current dietary guidelines are relatively disease agnostic and not personalized. So precision nutrition would actually add to the dietary guidelines. And that a lot of the dietary guidelines process right now depends on systematic reviews, and that there are gaps in terms of the studies that are needed. So this is another thing that I think is important about computational and data analytics. They can actually help design the right studies, identify what studies are actually needed. They're not just there to provide the results, the answers, but they can help design and plan what's needed going forward. So.
Yeah. Do you have final thoughts, either of you?
I think okay.
Go ahead, Bruce.
I saw a comment about the concern, a comment from one of the attendees about the concern that precision nutrition will worsen disparities and make things less accessible. Yes, I think that's a danger if it's applied a certain way. So if we have a situation where apps or things are being developed for only people who can afford them to help guide nutrition, or say you have a situation where dietitians or physicians or what have you are guided by a lot of these advanced analytics and can take better care of the people that they see, and of course not everyone has access to that same level of expertise, then yes, that can worsen disparities. But on the flip side, if precision nutrition is used to better craft food policy and nutrition-related policy and other types of policies that affect nutrition, then it can actually reduce disparities. So we have to keep in mind that these things need to be accessible to as many people as possible. so that, and it's not a situation where, you know, one class or one demographic of folks are designing these things and either use it for themselves or use it to like apply to other people. We need to have a situation where these are developed by a collective scientific and public health and policy, et cetera, community and tech community that is extremely diverse from all angles, I think, so that there's representation of all different communities. And as I mentioned earlier on today, that shouldn't be viewed as like a right thing to do or like a quote unquote nice thing to do. It's actually scientifically the right thing to do, because otherwise we're going to come up with the wrong answers, and we're not actually going to solve these problems. So diversity is not a nice thing to do. It's actually the scientifically proper thing to do, because you've got to capture all these viewpoints. Like if you have person A who has never experienced living in a certain area, has never experienced, you know, certain attitudes towards himself or herself, then that person just can't understand the context. So you need people who actually experience that context to say, hey, yeah, this is what I experienced. This is how it affects what I eat. This is how it affects my health, all these different things. And that needs to be then put into or incorporated into the different algorithms and analytics. So I think it's really important going forward.
Well, the other thing that is important is the fact that we are talking about health through nutrition, but what is behind that nutrition? What I mentioned before, food. So another player here is the food industry, which is huge, right? And I mean, they are brought on board, and some of the food industry, they look with fear because they see segmentation, and some, the more intelligent, they are jumping into this because they see an opportunity. But obviously, we have to take into consideration also the food industry in terms of the precision nutrition, because they are at the base.
My final thoughts are really focused, as we talked about yesterday, is on the precision part and being able to collect very good data, to spend a lot of time trying to think about what do we anticipate the variability, what will it be? And we know we're taking data from the literature where populations are more homogeneous, and so it'll be difficult to decide on effect sizes and such. But to really plan these studies in a very careful way so that this investment can be realized for all people, and that gets to the very recruitment details and data collection details.
One thing I'd like to add is that, and this actually came up in our session, our starting session this morning, when we were talking about training the next generation of scientists and researchers, we do have existing impairments, organizational impairments, to really doing precision nutrition well. And that's because so many departments and so many organizations are really organized around sort of traditional boundaries. So, and they're very arbitrary, right? So, you know, like, why is epidemiology separated from sociology, separated from economics? And also, you know, you can do that. You can go through every field and ask, why are these really separate? So that, you know, of course, there has to be like historical reasons why things come up, et cetera. But how do we then change the incentives to really promote more precision nutrition research, you know, and advancement? And so, you know, the trouble is a lot of the incentives are organized by department, by organization, et cetera. That's one of the reasons why this I think this NIH initiative is so exciting, because it's trying to stimulate change in terms of not just the area of research, but really like a broader change. So if the more we can do that, I think not only will nutrition benefits, but other fields will benefit too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe I throw a final question, and is the fact that so far, we have not been able to define precision nutrition. We haven't been able to define previous iterations like personalized nutrition or individualized nutrition and so on. So do you think that we are using the right term with precision? Because maybe we are, I don't think we'll be able to ever get to that 100% precision. Are we overselling the term? Should we, I know I shouldn't be asking this question at the end after 2 days talking about precision nutrition, but do you think you were, Bruce, talking about complexity versus, well, I don't know what the other term was, doesn't matter. But are we doing the right thing by calling this effort precision nutrition?
I have some thoughts. You want to go, Elizabeth, or you want me to go first?
No, go ahead. I was thinking about another comment from another participant. Go ahead.
So I think there's a difference between an aspirational term and an immediately applicable term. So I think, Jose, you're absolutely right. Like, we're never going to get a point where it's completely 100% precise. Like 100% precision is just not a realistic goal. But does that mean that we shouldn't aspire to something that's more precise? I think that's reasonable. Now, I understand that every term can have its drawbacks. So that, like, when you talk about precision, people might think about like the pill or it's just like kind of a scalpel where you can actually, and it gives people the wrong impression that maybe, diet or food can solve everything. And we know that, no, I mean, it's a factor, and there are other things. Like, 10 people can eat exactly the same diet and have very similar biological, physiological, social factors, but it can still turn out differently. So I think there are some perils in using precision nutrition there. But it seems like precision nutrition is used in part because, precision medicine is something that was established. That term was established a little earlier, and that seemed to resonate more with people. So I think it's a reasonable term as long as we understand what we really mean by that, and that it's not taking out of context.
Yeah. Well, I think that comment was very important to make. Just what you described. Yes. Sorry, Elizabeth.
Well, and it's precision. I think it's still evolving, the term. And it's precision as in accuracy of how well can we match our recommendations to the likelihood of disease in the future for an individual. But it's also personal. So it crosses the field of what will work for people versus what the model suggests. What is the prediction? So it includes nutrigenomics. It includes the socioeconomic factors that get in the way sometimes of adherence to health factors.
Okay, I think our time is up, right?
Yeah.
It was great to share with you and with all the speakers and panelists all this time, and obviously the audience that was very participative. So. Yeah, and the content will be on the web, so people can come back to it in the future.
Yeah, I wanted to give the opportunity also to credit. So we see all these names, and we've seen people give talks, etc. And great speakers. The panelists were fantastic, but there are also people that have really worked behind the scenes to put all of this together. And so if you look at the NIDDK website, there's a whole organizing committee that's listed there. So Josephine Boyington, Andrew Brenner, Allison Brown, Christopher Lynch, Holly Nicastro, whom you saw yesterday, Charlotte Pratt, Joe Reedy, Karen Reagan, Scarlett Shee, Porter Redavas, and Ashley Vargas. So, and then we've also had Susie Myers and Jennifer Evans really work the council behind the scenes so that everyone can see what they're seeing right now. So I just want to toss out credit. And then one other person, saved the best for last, Kimberly Barsh, who's been just fantastic in terms of just bringing everything together. I don't think we could have done this without her.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, thank you all very much, and we'll
Thank
see you
you.
again.